A wealthy man walked into the luxurious Whitehaven Hotel, but all he received was disdain and a door slammed in his face. They didn't know who he was, nor did they care. Yet, only weeks later, he returned, not as a guest, but as the new owner of the establishment. The story begins with humiliation but takes an unforeseen turn. Deep-seated prejudices are laid bare, and smug individuals are forced to confront harsh truths. Can power and success challenge the entrenched biases of those who discriminate? This journey isn't merely about revenge. It's about justice and breaking barriers. It poses a profound question. When all privileges and status are stripped away, what remains of you? Follow this gripping tale to witness an ending that is both stunning and utterly unexpected. Just moments ago, they didn't even notice me. Their eyes slid past me as though I were invisible, focused instead on their polished black shoes, elegant posture, and the complexion they believed could never belong to someone like me. Their smugness was impossible to ignore. A cold, dismissive smile curled their lips, as if fate itself had decreed my place. An outsider, unwelcome and out of place. Their invitation for me to leave was polite, but their contempt was undeniable. I didn't leave. Instead, I stood tall, my shoulders taut, my chin raised high. I owed no explanations, nor did I feel the need to prove anything. But soon enough, they were forced to face an undeniable truth. The Whitehaven Hotel, which they believed to be an untouchable fortress, now belonged to me. Yes, I stood at the entrance of this opulent hotel, not as an outsider but as its new owner. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me, and I let out a wry chuckle. The tailored suit hugged my frame perfectly, every inch of it bespoke. My shoes gleamed like tiny mirrors, reflecting the light in the grand Whitehaven lobby. In my pocket, the keys lay silently, yet their power was undeniable. They unlocked a world I had conquered, one of wealth, success, and recognition. I had overcome every obstacle, even those unseen. But then, another barrier emerged, not one made of stone or glass, but one built from the deeply ingrained biases of the people here. They didn't see me. They didn't see my skin. They only saw a faint shadow on the periphery, someone they deemed unworthy of existing in their world. I could feel their scrutinizing eyes, dissecting every detail as though measuring my worth. My chest tightened, my breathing grew heavier, but I refused to let their stares diminish me. In the end, it was their gaze that defined them, not me. And I realized something profound. Whether they accepted it or not, I would remain. I would stand tall as myself, an image they could not deny. I was no shadow to be easily erased. I was simply a person of color stepping into a world they believed was not meant for someone like me. In their eyes, I was an anomaly, an error, a misplaced element disrupting the perfect picture they had painted. This was their portrait of grandeur, where everything radiated prestige, comfort, and hospitality. But no, the atmosphere here was heavy with tension, as if my very presence was an unspoken problem. Each step I took on the marble floor felt like a quiet defiance. The grand lobby, adorned with dazzling gold chandeliers, opulent furnishings, and immaculate design, should have evoked admiration. Instead, I felt an icy chill down my spine, not from the air conditioning, but from the people inhabiting this space. Luxury came with arrogance. Everything here seemed designed to flaunt superiority, to make you feel like an outsider. My goal was straightforward: check in like any other guest. But as I approached the reception desk, I noticed something peculiar. The staff exchanged glances, quick and furtive, as though I were part of a silent conversation I wasn't privy to. I didn't know what awaited me, but one thing was certain. They could judge me. They could distance themselves from me, but I refused to live by their prejudices. They would not control my story. I stepped up to the desk where the manager stood, a blond man with a mechanical smile. He didn't even look up as I approached, and I knew exactly what was coming next. When he finally met my gaze, his eyes conveyed more than words ever could. He looked at me as if he understood everything about me in an instant, from my neatly pressed attire to my polished demeanor. Yet none of it mattered to him. "I'm sorry, but we have no rooms available for you," he said, his tone courteous, though his certainty was striking. It wasn't the rejection that surprised me. It was the unwavering conviction in his words. He spoke as if delivering a decision that had been made long before, dictated by a system, a formula designed to assess people based solely on appearance. And now he was merely the messenger. Opulence often walks hand in hand with arrogance, and their words felt like the closing act of a long-rehearsed play. But for me, it was only the beginning. I could have revealed my name at that very moment, and everything would have shifted instantly. They would have rushed to apologize, showered me with their best service, praised me, and flattered me beyond measure. But I chose not to disrupt their performance. I wanted to see how far they would go before realizing they could no longer continue. At that moment, a security guard approached. A large man with a bald, polished head. His expression was neutral, his politeness rigid. He advanced with deliberate intent, leaving no room for negotiation. "Sir, I need to ask you to leave the Whitehaven Hotel," he said in a calm yet firm tone. There was no hesitation in his voice, no opportunity for debate. I met his gaze without saying a word. In that moment, I had no intention of arguing or proving myself. Their ignorance and arrogance had already taught me a lesson I would never forget, but it wasn't worth my time to explain. I turned toward the exit, my steps echoing on the marble floor like a bell heralding the arrival of change. They didn't yet understand how close they stood to a world about to be upended. They saw only what they wanted to see in me, but I knew, deep down, that their world teetered on the edge of an inevitable shift. A few steps from the door, I stopped and turned back for one last look at the Whitehaven Hotel. Soon, this place would belong to me, and then they would realize how deeply they had misjudged me. Illusions can be shattered. Weeks passed since I left the Whitehaven Hotel, avoiding unnecessary conflict. But the story didn't end there. I walked away quietly, saying nothing, but that didn't mean I was without a plan. During that time, a clear strategy took shape in my mind. My goal wasn't just to reclaim my dignity, it was to seize control of their world. Ironically, my life had always been a step ahead of those who judged me solely on appearances. Now, I stood before the same city, the same building, but in an entirely different position. I was no longer a guest, I was the new owner. As I sat with the attorney to sign the transfer documents, a wave of emotion washed over me. Not anger, but a peculiar and indescribable satisfaction. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of the pen, its weight grounding me in the reality of this moment. This was the moment when every insult transformed into power. Humiliation had become the key to unlocking everything. I had no intention of retaliating with childish pranks or petty retribution. My objective was far more complex. I wanted to dismantle the illusions they had built for themselves. Their pride would become the instrument of their downfall. As my hand rested on the cold surface of the attorney's desk, I couldn't help but smirk slightly at the sight of the documents confirming my ownership of the Whitehaven Hotel. It was mine now, and this was only the beginning. After signing the papers, I didn't rush. I returned to the Whitehaven Hotel with a new purpose: to observe every employee, those who continued their work, oblivious to the impending transformation of their world. To them, I remained a shadow, invisible. My name hadn't yet appeared in any meeting or memo. This granted me the freedom to watch them in their natural state. Meeting with the general manager unfolded exactly as I anticipated. He was a man brimming with confidence, bordering on arrogance, believing he had everything under control. "Our staff is stable and highly professional," he said with a note of pride in his voice. "We haven't had any resignations in a long time, and our turnover rate is remarkably low." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, but inside, my resolve only grew stronger. I knew their world stood on the brink of collapse, and they had no idea. I had studied each of them closely: the blonde manager who refused to check me in, the security guard who escorted me out. All of them had returned to their routines, unaware of the abyss waiting ahead. Descending the staircase after the meeting, I let my hand graze the cold metal railing, feeling the chill seep into my skin. It was a reminder of what I already knew. In their tightly controlled world, I was the one in command now. They were mere pawns in a game I had been silently playing for quite some time. I paused, contemplating the decision I was about to make. Should I act immediately, exposing everything and firing them on the spot? Or should I let them continue in their bubble of false stability for a little while longer, savoring the illusion of control they had built for themselves? The answer lay in patience. Each moment would become a weapon, perfectly crafted for the performance I was preparing. The day I chose to unveil my first move came unexpectedly. Walking through the corridors, I glanced at the Whitehaven Hotel lobby and saw him, the blonde manager. He was engrossed in his work, occasionally glancing up from his papers to review the ledgers. He didn't recognize me, even though I was just steps away. But this time, I was no longer an invisible shadow. I was the master of this building, and only I knew it. His face was relaxed, devoid of tension, blissfully unaware that his future lay entirely in my hands. I could change everything in an instant. With just a word, his confidence would crumble, and the calm order of his life would shatter. But I wasn't in a hurry. My satisfaction wasn't in swiftly breaking him down, but in watching them dig their own graves, allowing their actions to orchestrate their downfall. I turned and walked away. Each step felt more deliberate, more purposeful than ever before. Today, I entered the Whitehaven Hotel not as the person who once walked out humiliated, but as someone wielding absolute power. Everything had shifted. This hotel was no longer the fortress that had denied me. It was my dominion, and I was ready to take control. The air in the room felt heavier, every breath sharper, more defined. Perhaps it was just my imagination, but I could feel the weight of the confrontation ahead, with those who had looked down on me weeks earlier. They didn't know the fire within me. My stride remained calm, but inside, my resolve burned like a quiet flame, waiting to ignite. Just before entering the conference room, I paused. Taking a deep breath, I allowed a faint smile to cross my lips. I knew exactly what I was about to do, and I intended to do it without warning. That was the point. I wanted them to feel the ground shift beneath their feet as their world began to spiral. When I stepped into the room, everyone was already seated. No one noticed me at first. I chose a corner seat, one that allowed me to observe without drawing attention. The blonde manager stood near the board, confidently outlining the day's agenda. His arrogance was still intact, oblivious to the seismic shift that had already occurred. I sat silently, my gaze fixed on him. He had no idea his carefully curated world was already crumbling. When our eyes finally met, I saw the faintest flicker of recognition, a subtle shift in his expression. It was fleeting, but enough for me to know the seed of doubt had been planted. His shoulders stiffened, and his voice faltered mid-sentence. First, his face paled. Then, almost immediately, a professional mask slipped into place, concealing his unease. But I knew, deep down, he understood that everything had irrevocably changed. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady yet cold, as though grappling with something unalterable. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward us. The atmosphere crackled with tension as everyone focused on the unspoken confrontation. I sat there, calm and composed, a faint smirk curling at the edges of my lips. My response was deliberate, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "I'm your new boss," I said, my voice low but resolute, carrying an authority that froze the room. The silence was deafening, the weight of my words hitting like a hammer. I watched as his expression shifted. First disbelief, then shock, and finally, fear. His eyes widened, his brows knit together, and a pallor swept over his face. He swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening, unable to speak. The other employees began exchanging uncertain glances, confusion evident in their gestures. They looked from one another to me, and then to the blonde manager, as if trying to piece together a puzzle they couldn't fathom. It was the calm before the storm, the moment when everyone senses something monumental is about to happen, yet feels powerless to stop it. The manager tried to speak, his lips moving soundlessly. His breathing quickened, his chest heaving as his eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. I could see his carefully built plans unraveling before him, each layer of his self-assured image disintegrating. The world he believed to be unshakable, his career, his status, his authority was turning against him. Now he was just an employee under my command. And the cruel irony was unmistakable. The man who once escorted me out now found himself at my mercy. I stood slowly, my movements deliberate, and began walking toward the door. Not a single person in the room dared to speak. They were too stunned, their minds struggling to process what had just transpired. But this was only the beginning, the first step in a plan they couldn't begin to predict. I was ready to transform the Whitehaven Hotel into something entirely new. This wasn't just about renovating walls or furniture. I would restructure everything. The systems, the processes, and most importantly, the mindset of the people who worked here. After declaring myself the new owner, no one knew what to expect next. Perhaps they anticipated immediate reforms or sweeping changes. But I wasn't someone they could predict. I didn't play games my opponents could prepare for. I have always been fascinated by what lies beneath the surface of people standing on the edge of collapse. With each passing day, I've come to understand the extent of my power, a force that can melt away confidence, shatter illusions, and topple biases with nothing more than a glance or a subtle gesture. I could obliterate their world in an instant, but I chose another path, a meticulously calculated, deliberate one. The satisfaction of this moment isn't enough. I want more. All I need is to strip away the masks they wear, forcing them to dismantle their own defenses. I want to see them, those who once thought themselves invincible, thrust into chaos, their once unchallengeable values crumbling into nothingness. I want them to feel the sting of the arrogance and prejudices they have upheld for so long. One morning, as I prepared for the day ahead, a gentle wave of satisfaction washed over me. At last, I could see them face a new reality. They would now handle tasks they once deemed beneath them. I made the decision to rewrite their schedules. Those they had looked down upon would now work alongside them as equals, or even in roles they had once avoided. This was my test, a challenge to see how their pride would falter under these new rules. The first week passed, and I observed a chessboard slowly taking shape. Every move I made was calculated, every step deliberate, ensuring that when the time came, their downfall would be inevitable. I watched their smugness give way to fractures. Those who had once scorned others now found themselves trapped in situations from which they could not escape. The blonde manager, with his inflated ego, was now negotiating with subordinates or overseeing tasks he'd never deigned to touch before. His shoulders grew stiff, his jaw tightened, and his face bore an increasing weariness with each passing day. The helplessness in his eyes, despite his attempts to conceal it, was unmistakable, a desperate clinging to his last vestiges of pride. The other staff members fared no better. The confidence they had in their positions and perceived importance melted like ice under the sun. Long conversations and friendly smiles had vanished, leaving only strained silence in their wake. One day, as I walked through the Whitehaven Hotel lobby, I encountered him. He looked exhausted, his eyes etched with uncertainty. Despite his attempt to appear composed, I could feel the unease in his every movement. He stepped toward me, his voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk," he said, trying to maintain his composure. But I could see it, the unspoken acknowledgement that he was facing a change he could neither stop nor control. I paused, a faint smile playing on my lips. Standing before him, I felt the weight of the moment I had been anticipating for so long. He clung to the illusion of his importance, but I could see his confidence fracturing with every passing second. I let him speak, each word a desperate effort to hold onto what he knew he was losing. His voice wavered, every syllable heavy with the fear of slipping further from stability. He tried to convince me of his indispensable role in Whitehaven Hotel's success. But his clenched fists and the faint twitch of his fingers betrayed the anxiety coursing through him. He was grasping for power that no longer belonged to him. His words rang hollow, a faint echo of a futile argument. In his mind, only one thought dominated: how to keep his position under my leadership. When he finished, I allowed the silence to stretch, then smiled, a calm, measured expression, not mocking, but a reminder of authority. I locked eyes with him and spoke, my voice low and deliberate. Do you remember the day you threw me out of here? His face went pale, the blood draining from his cheeks. I saw the fear in his eyes, the realization sinking in. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his shoulders slumped, as if the ground beneath him had given way. In that moment, he understood that all his words and efforts to project strength were meaningless. Everything he had built, his arrogance, his fabricated sense of importance, was crumbling before him. The room fell deathly silent. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat, leaving only the sound of labored breaths. The layers of his carefully crafted facade were falling apart, piece by piece. He no longer held any control over the situation. Now I was the one who held his fate in my hands. But this was only the beginning. Each day I walked through the halls of the Whitehaven Hotel. I felt like I was orchestrating a grand chess match, a game where I could predict every move of my opponents. One by one, their actions were dismantled, their positions rendered obsolete. They didn't realize that for a long time now, I had been the one pulling the strings. To them, I was just a shadow, a faint figure in the background. But I knew what they didn't. The truth of their character, the lies they clung to, all would be laid bare as they lost their grip on the narrative. From the moment I stepped into Whitehaven Hotel as its new owner, I understood that patience was key. It would allow me to uncover their true nature. I began to challenge them, small tasks disguised as harmless changes, subtle shifts in their daily routines, and additional responsibilities. To them, these seemed like minor adjustments, nothing more than an inconvenience. But to me, they were pieces of a larger, carefully crafted plan. I watched, I studied, I waited. I wanted to see how far they would go to cling to their positions. Those who had grown accustomed to stability, power, and status were now beginning to falter as the world around them shifted, and I was the one shifting it. With every passing day, I felt the strength within me growing. A strength not just to transform this place, but to change the people who were desperately grasping at power that had already slipped through their fingers. I was ready to witness them unravel, step by step, as I introduced new tasks and made seemingly small decisions, just to see how they would react. At first, the changes only made them uncomfortable. But soon I began to notice the cracks. One person tried to hide their mistakes, another avoided responsibility, and others, instead of facing the truth, were quick to push their colleagues under the bus to protect themselves. Sitting in my office, I quietly observed the atmosphere shifting day by day among the staff. The tension was palpable. The polite smiles faded, and the empty words turned cold. One day, a conversation between two employees revealed everything. "I can't finish this on time, but if you help me, I'll tell the manager it was your effort," one said, his face pleading. The other laughed dryly, dismissive. "You don't want me to do it for you. I'll just tell them you botched the whole thing." That line felt like the end of the charade. They were ready to trample each other for self-preservation. That was when the masks began to fall. At the end of the day, I called everyone into the meeting room. No one knew why, but the air was heavy with unease. Some exchanged nervous glances. Others tried to mask their discomfort. The room was silent, as though everyone was bracing for the inevitable. I stood before them, unhurried, letting the silence fill the space. This wasn't merely a pause. It was an unavoidable confrontation. "I've been observing you all for weeks," I began, my voice calm but cutting. "And what have I seen? Lies. You've been deceiving yourselves, and trying to deceive me." I said nothing more, letting the screen behind me come to life with the evidence I had prepared. Surveillance footage, documents, records of their plans, all laid bare. Every lie, every misstep was exposed. Their faces turned ashen as they saw the undeniable truth displayed before them. "You thought you could hide behind your lies?" I continued, my tone steady but unyielding. "But now you can't. Everything you've built, every career you've crafted, has been rooted in deception. And now it has all come crashing down. The room descended into despair. They understood the game was over. This wasn't just a revelation. It was the moment they realized their lives, their careers, everything they had relied upon, were shattered. I knew I had seized control, and none of them could escape the web they had spun for themselves. But this wasn't the end. I didn't just want to expose them, I wanted to change everything at its core. I didn't want to stop at unmasking their mistakes. I wanted them to face the consequences, not in some abstract sense, but in the most personal way possible. And so, I began restructuring the Whitehaven Hotel, step by step, quietly and methodically. The privileges they once took for granted were stripped away, while others were given new opportunities. But everyone was forced to confront the truth. Those who had thrived on lies now had to pay the price. Under the light of the changes I implemented, I watched as the long-revered values of the Whitehaven Hotel began to crumble. The new staff I hired, most of them people of color, individuals who had been overlooked by society, now held leadership positions, fulfilling dreams they'd never thought possible. Those who had been deemed unworthy were given chances, while the complacent had to accept their new reality. Every day, I watched conflicts slowly unfold. The old staff, accustomed to their privileges and status, now had to grapple with a completely different reality. They tried to cling to their positions, but the harder they tried, the more they realized that the world they once dominated was collapsing around them. What they had taken for granted was now gone, irretrievably. I remember one particular day vividly. Richard Hayes, the former manager, the man who had refused me a room, the one I had confronted in the past, had to face this new reality head-on. As I walked into the lobby, I saw him standing behind the reception desk, holding a stack of papers, his face tense, his hands trembling. This man, once a symbol of authority and confidence, was now performing simple tasks he had previously scorned. A family entered the lobby. A mother, a father, and 2 children, all of them black. The moment he saw them, his face turned pale, his expression shifting from shock to fear. He realized that now, he had to serve the very people he had once looked down upon. Those he had dismissed as beneath him now stood before him, demanding the service he had once denied them. "Good afternoon," he said, but his voice quivered, stripped of the confidence he once carried. The father responded politely, "We have a reservation for the week. We'd like to check in." He nodded awkwardly, fumbling through the check-in process. His fingers moved sluggishly across the keyboard, his eyes darting away, avoiding direct contact, as if he wished to disappear on the spot. I stood there, silently observing. I didn't intervene. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I watched his pride crumble, torn apart by the reality he had built for himself. When the check-in process was complete and the family moved away, I stepped closer to him. He didn't dare look at me. His eyes stayed glued to the floor, his shoulders slumped as though he was trying to make himself smaller. "Do you understand now what it feels like to be ignored?" I asked, my voice steady but weighted with meaning. He didn't respond immediately. I could see his shoulders sag further, his face pale as if all strength had been drained from him. "It's just a job," he muttered, his tone attempting to mask the despair beneath. I didn't let him escape the truth. "You refused to let me check in. Today, you're serving the very people you once looked down on." He raised his head, his eyes filled with fear and shame. It wasn't just fear of his new boss. It was the realization of his own mediocrity. The prejudices and pride he had clung to were now utterly shattered. His voice wavered, uncertain, grasping for words that wouldn't come. He understood that every action, every belief he had held on to had led to this moment. Now he had no choice but to face the truth. I said nothing more. I gave him a curt nod and turned away, leaving him with the weight of what had just occurred. This wasn't the end, but it was a pivotal moment. A chance for him to realize that the old order would never return. I knew the conclusion was drawing near. The employees who had once exuded confidence in their superiority were now confronting the greatest challenge of their lives. I watched as their world collapsed, as the lies and biases they had embraced began to destroy them from within. But this wasn't just about revenge. It was a reckoning. They needed more than to acknowledge their mistakes. They needed to feel their world disintegrating beneath them. Today, I decided it was time. Everyone who had once discriminated against me, who had believed their superiority stemmed from flawed ideals, would now face the truth. Their status had changed. I gave them one final choice. They could leave, accept compensation, and forget everything, or they could stay and continue working, but only under the new rules. I stood in the conference room, facing the people who had once embodied the culture of discrimination within the Whitehaven Hotel. Their faces betrayed their anxiety and frustration. These individuals, who had wielded power, now realized that everything they had built was crumbling. "You have two choices," I said, my voice cold but resolute. "You can leave with compensation, or you can stay and adhere to the new policies. The rules have changed, and you will follow them." Some lowered their heads, their trembling fingers nervously adjusting the papers in front of them. They knew they couldn't survive in this new structure. Others, with nothing left to lose, looked at me with hesitant eyes, aware that staying was their only viable option. The game was reaching its final move. "I'll give you the chance to decide," I continued, my tone calm but commanding. "But remember this. If you choose to stay, everything about you must change. Your attitude, your work ethic, and your worldview. Some of you won't be able to handle it." At that moment, Richard Hayes, the former manager who had once refused to serve me during my first visit to the Whitehaven Hotel, raised his hand and asked, "What happens if we choose to leave?" His voice trembled, unable to hide his worry. His face betrayed his confusion, as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice. I looked him directly in the eye, without hesitation. "If you leave, you'll have to start over. No privileges, no protection from old connections. Just the chance to reconsider your life. But at least you won't have to live under the weight of your lies and arrogance anymore." His face darkened, his shoulders shaking slightly. I could see the bitter truth dawning on him. His old life, built on discrimination and false privileges, was over. He would have to confront a reality he could no longer deny. A few days later, on the last working day for some of the staff, I watched as they packed their belongings, preparing to leave. They couldn't accept the changes and refused to face the new order I had established. Those who stayed began to learn how to adapt to the reality that they were no longer above everyone else. The prejudices and false sense of superiority were slowly eroded. I'll never forget one moment in particular. Richard Hayes, the same man who had once denied me service, stood behind the reception desk, holding a stack of papers. His face was tense, his hands trembling. The man who had once been the embodiment of power and confidence was now performing simple tasks he had previously deemed beneath him. Family walked into the lobby. A mother, father, and 2 children, all of them black. The moment he saw them, his face turned ashen, his expression shifting from surprise to fear. He realized that now, he had to serve the very people he once deemed inferior. Those he had dismissed as unworthy now stood before him, demanding the service he had once denied them. One morning, I walked into the lobby of the Whitehaven Hotel and saw Richard Hayes, the former manager, standing near the exit. His shoulders sagged, his posture unsteady, like a man utterly defeated. This was the same man who had refused me a room, the one who didn't care who I was or why I needed help. Now he stood there, fully aware that everything had changed. I approached him and stopped by his side. He didn't look at me, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, as if trying to escape the world around him. Calmly, I spoke, "Don't you think you should know who I am now?" But he didn't respond. His face was devoid of emotion, his eyes hollow. Yet I could see it in him. Deep down he had realized the truth. His entire life had been built on a flawed foundation. Everything he had once taken pride in was now gone. He gave a small nod, his gaze still cast downward. Then, without a word, he turned and quietly walked out the door. I stood there, watching as his figure disappeared into the distance. I didn't feel anger, nor did I feel satisfaction. It was simply an ending. The end of a story that had begun with humiliation but concluded with justice. I understood that this wasn't about revenge. It was about closing a chapter of my life. Those who once believed themselves to be in control were now forced to confront the truths they had long avoided. And I, standing there, witnessed the collapse of everything they had built, knowing that justice had finally been served. This story began with disdain and humiliation but ended with justice and transformation. A person who was once rejected returned not only to claim power but to dismantle an entrenched prejudice system. The people who had been so complacent, who believed their status and power would shield them forever, now faced a different reality. Arrogance was never a solid foundation for success. From this story, we learn a profound lesson. Prejudice not only harms others but ultimately destroys those who harbor it. Instead of judging someone by appearances or background, we must learn to recognize their true worth through their effort and character. If the story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about someone who was once rejected rising to power? Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to join us for more inspiring stories. Even deeper lessons await you in the upcoming videos. Thank you for watching.